You've set up your Power Platform environments and lined up your ALM pipelines, but does it ever feel like making a change in one place breaks something else? Today, I'm unpacking the invisible feedback loops between multi-environment architecture and ALM strategies that can either make your deployment unstoppable or quietly set up a domino effect of headaches. Stick around to see how rethinking one seemingly minor governance detail could save hours of troubleshooting down the line. The domino effect of environment design. If you've ever thought we're just tweaking a connector setting, how much trouble could that cause? And you might want to clear your calendar. One of the most common headaches I see starts with a single well-meaning change inside a Power Platform environment. Maybe it's a security policy update. Maybe it's tweaking the configuration of a connector you think barely anyone uses outside production. But the fallout? That can burn through an entire week in support tickets and quick Teams calls as every dependency downstream suddenly decides to protest. Let's be honest, most teams sketch out their environment map with 3 circles: dev, test, prod, drop them in a slide and declare victory. It looks tidy, the arrows point in all the right directions, and on paper everyone agrees this is enterprise ready. But ask anyone who's been running Power Platform at scale and they'll tell you those neat boxes hide a mess of hidden wires running underneath. Every environment isn't just a playground. It's wired up with pipelines, connectors, and permissions that crisscross in ways nobody really documents. Once you start layering in DLP policies and network restrictions, a small tweak in dev or test can echo across the whole system in ways that are hard to anticipate. And that's just the start. You'd think deploying a new security policy, maybe locking down a connector to keep company data tight, should be a neutral move if it happens outside production. But you roll this out in test or dev, and suddenly the dev team's apps won't launch, automations stall, and those isolated changes block solution validation in your deployment pipeline. Picture this: a team disables the HTTP connector in non-prod, aiming to avoid unapproved callouts. Sensible, right? But suddenly the ALM pipeline throws errors, because it actually needs that connector to validate the solution package before anything moves forward. So nothing passes validation, work gets stuck, and everyone's left searching through logs looking for a bug that isn't in the code base at all. Every one of these minor adjustments is like tipping the first in a row of dominoes lined up through your ALM, governance, and data flows. What looked like a security best practice on a Wednesday turns into a series of escalations by Friday, because environments in Power Platform aren't really standalone. Microsoft's own enterprise deployment guides back this up. The majority of ALM pain starts not in the CI/CD tooling, but with dependencies or settings that weren't accounted for at the environment level. In other words, the platform amplifies both the best and worst of your design. If you build in tight feedback loops, issues show up earlier. If you assume everything moves in a straight line, surprises are sure to follow. To help visualize just how tangled this can get, think about your environments like a highway with sequential gates. Every time someone adds a policy, blocks a connector, or changes a user role, it's like dropping a new gate across one exit or on-ramp. It only takes one gate being out of sync to turn a smooth-flowing highway into bumper-to-bumper gridlock. Meanwhile, that gridlock isn't always where you expect. That's the trick. The pain often hits somewhere downstream, where testers and analysts find out they can't finish their checks, and business users realize automations that worked last week no longer even fire. And if you're reading this thinking, but we test every policy before rollout, that's great, but the complexity comes from combinations, not just individual settings. It's the subtle dependency where a connector, seemingly unused, exists solely for solution packaging or admin validation during deployment, or an environment variable that only has meaning in dev, but whose absence later means a pipeline step can't even start. None of this is mapped on your standard environment diagram, but it's painfully real for anyone chasing a root cause after a Friday outage. Here's where it gets more interesting. Most feedback loops in Power Platform environments are completely invisible until they break. Teams spend ages troubleshooting at the ALM layer, writing scripts, rebuilding pipelines, while the real problem is a permission or connector that shifted in a non-prod sandbox 3 weeks back. Microsoft's deployment patterns now advise explicitly mapping these cross-environment dependencies, but let's be honest, most teams only do this after something explodes. So ask yourself, which feedback loops in your environment setup could quietly sabotage the next deployment? Where are the settings or policies that, if nudged out of line, would jam the whole flow? This is why thinking of your environment as just a box misses the point. In reality, it's a lever When designed with the right feedback, it multiplies productivity and reduces risk. Ignore the hidden loops, and you'll end up playing whack-a-mole long after go live. Of course, the real question isn't just about these boxes on their own, it's how you move changes between them that often turns a contained hiccup into an enterprise-level incident. And that's where your ALM process either saves the day or quietly sets you up for the next domino to tip. When ALM pipelines collide with real-world complexity, if you've ever set up an ALM pipeline and thought, now we've got repeatability and less risk, you're not alone. That's the promise after all. Set up your CI/CD, build your environment chain, and let the automated releases take over. But there's always something lurking just beneath that glossy surface. The script says ALM brings control and consistency, but the unwritten reality is we deal with edge cases almost every week. No matter how clean your pipelines look in Azure DevOps or GitHub Actions, the reality is that it only takes one small drift between environments to flip that switch from automated deployment to manual triage. Sound familiar? Let's say you've mapped out your dev, test, and prod environments with automation pushing new changes right down the line. Maybe your team did a walkthrough, double-checked that all environment variables are there and connectors are set up the same way in every place. But here's where it gets unpredictable. A new security control gets rolled out in production, blocking an HTTP connector nobody even noticed in the dev workflows. The pipeline, blissfully ignorant, continues with its next release, passes all tests in dev and staging, and then falls over in production, leaving you scanning error logs and tracking failed flows in the middle of a release window. ALM tooling, whether you're running classic solutions or relying on Power Platform pipelines, expects your environments to be clones of each other. But they never really are, right? Over time, even the most disciplined teams run into drift. Maybe dev gets a new preview connector because someone is testing out a feature, or a licensing quirk only shows up in prod because that's where the special capacity plan lives. Sometimes test is lagging behind because it takes weeks to convince someone in procurement to buy just one extra add-on. Suddenly, your nice, clean deployment script is trying to use a connector in test that doesn't even exist in prod, or it expects a service principal to have permissions only assigned in dev. Before you know it, every deployment feels like a new mystery to solve. The real headache is that these issues never show up in your pipeline logs until the switch happens. Fixing one blocker just exposes the next. It's a game of ALM whack-a-mole. You solve for a missing permission in test, run your pipeline again, and now a flow authentication fails because a connector is missing in prod. By the time you trace everything back, you've spent days bringing together DevOps, security, and support just to unravel what looked like a one-off error. And this technical friction isn't just about efficiency. Gartner's research makes it clear that the root of most Power Platform deployment failures inside large organizations is inconsistency between environments. At first, that might sound like a process issue. Just get your environments in sync, right? But in real life, in sync is a moving target. People come and go, connectors move in and out of preview, and environments pick up quirks and exceptions nobody documents. It's not just about connectors or security roles, even licensing and provisioning methods slip in unnoticed. The craziest example I've heard came from a retail company running international stores. They spent nearly a month chasing down a release bug nobody could explain. Test and staging worked fine, but in prod, certain automated emails just wouldn't send. After tearing apart every layer, it turned out the problem was a single environment variable that one developer had used in dev but never set up anywhere else. The pipeline pulled that missing reference over and over again, but only prod's unique configuration made it blow up publicly. That one forgotten variable cost weeks of releases and a mountain of support escalations. It's easy to look at those incidents and think, well, we'll catch these next time. But the reality is you never know which edge case is going to break deployment next. And as these invisible conflicts pile up, something bigger happens. Teams start quietly losing confidence in the whole pipeline process. It's not just a failed deployment you're dealing with now. It's issues getting flagged to stakeholders, business teams second-guessing every new release, and people bypassing the pipeline altogether just to get things moving again. That's when automation goes from a productivity booster to something teams try to work around. So the natural question is, how can you actually spot when your ALM isn't doing its job, or worse, has started working against you? You can keep monitoring logs and putting out fires, but that only treats the symptoms. Real ALM resilience comes from finding and mapping those edge cases before they seep into production. And it starts with understanding how your environment design, deployment routines, and governance intersect in ways that never show up in the official official architecture diagram. Because in Power Platform, the hidden cost of these mismatches isn't just technical, it's trust. Teams start to believe they can't rely on what's supposed to make life easier, and that ripple carries all the way up to management and business leads. And once trust goes, process overhaul is never far behind. As tempting as it is to focus on technical details, there's a bigger feedback loop at work, one that exists between your deployment routines, your governance policies, and the day-to-day productivity of your teams. Let's get into the ways those unseen loops can quietly turn governance from a strategic advantage into a roadblock for everyone building on the platform. Governance, the unseen bottleneck or accelerator. If you've ever rolled out a shiny new security policy only to get a flood of complaints the next morning, you know exactly how governance can trip up even the best intentions. Suddenly you're stuck in the middle, pushing for tighter controls to protect company data, but getting calls from the development team about broken automations and lost access. It's a familiar dance. Everyone agrees governance is critical, but nobody loves when it becomes the villain. The thing is, every policy you introduce is supposed to raise the bar. Better protection, better oversight, fewer gaps for data to leak through. Yet, in practice, every new rule is another turn of the screw, and it's hard to know when you're creating safety or just locking everyone out. There's this unwritten trade-off happening. Tighten things up, and you might think you're adding order. But every additional DLP rule or permission tweak runs the risk of stopping someone just trying to get their job done. The outcome? Developers lose sync with their environments. Citizen developers hit walls at the worst times. You see it every day with classic DLP policy moves. Set up a quick rule to prevent sharing between environments, and for a few days everything seems fine. Then a flow that worked perfectly yesterday suddenly fails, and you start seeing tickets from business users who can't send approvals or connect their apps. What's tricky is how indirect the fallout is. You set the DLP policy in one place and don't notice the effect until much later, often in a part of the business you didn't expect. There's that classic moment where a business user, happy with their automation running smoothly in test, moves to production only to find permissions missing or connectors blocked. And that's when you get the support desk pings and emails asking, was there a change made last night? But by then, the root cause is buried under layers of policies most folks never see. Microsoft's Power Platform adoption studies confirm what most admins have experienced for years. Bad governance at the wrong point solves nothing. What actually happens is the number of support tickets climbs, while business users quietly look for workarounds to get through the day. The right policy at the wrong layer has more impact, and not in a good way. It's not just about more control, it's also about where and when you apply that control. Place a major DLP policy at the wrong environment, and you'll instantly see what happens. Automations error out, integrations fail, and developers get locked out without even knowing why. There are always stories that stick. I know an IT team who, in the name of increasing security, enabled conditional access throughout their Power Platform environments. On paper, it checked every compliance box. In reality, it meant the development team couldn't even open the Power Apps editor without jumping through 6 layers of identity prompts, at best. At worst, it just flat out blocked access. So the apps nobody could edit started aging in place, with nobody realizing until after something broke. Suddenly, it's not just about locking down data. It's about users being unable to even maintain or fix the solutions keeping the business running. When you step back, the whole thing is eerily similar to city traffic management. Too many red lights crammed into busy intersections, and it's gridlock, nobody moves, tempers flare, and productivity tanks. Open all the lights and let traffic rip without rules, and you get chaos. People want governance to be invisible when it works, but as soon as it gets out of sync with real-world needs, everything stops. And unlike traffic, you can't always see the jam building until users start laying on the horn. The real signals that your governance is off usually hide in the patterns, not the big failures. Look for clusters of similar support tickets, integration failures, sudden connector permissions issues, apps mysteriously freezing after a new policy rollout. Even random complaints about the Power Apps editor running slow can point straight back to new layers of access enforcement. Those early warnings are easy to miss if all you're watching is the dashboard saying environment's healthy. But pay attention to feedback from makers, admins, and business users. Once those grumbles spill over into repeated support calls, you've crossed from security into bottleneck territory. And here's the flip side. Governance done right doesn't just prevent breaches, it speeds up development cycles. Well-designed feedback loops make issues visible early before they lock someone out in production. When you've got the right policies, Signals show up quickly, small failures in sandbox or dev, never in front of a customer, or during go live. That early warning system frees you to keep security tight without sacrificing agility. Miss those signals though, and all you've done is create a maze that users and admins have to navigate blindfolded. The cost isn't just measured in hours spent on support or days lost to block deployments. It's the quiet frustration and workarounds that start cropping up as teams figure out how to get things done, regardless of what the rulebook says. That's when you know it's time to rethink how feedback moves through your architecture, not just who gets access to what. But what happens when those warning signs pile up and nobody acts? You're looking at silent technical debt building in the background, systems that seem fine right until they're not. And by the time someone does notice, the price is usually much bigger than just a single support ticket. It's time to talk about those loops, the clues that something's bleeding value out of your power platform, and how to catch them before they turn into your next emergency. Spotting and breaking the costliest feedback loops. When you hear technical debt, most people immediately think of messy code or quick hacks that pile up over time, the stuff that everyone knows needs fixing, but nobody gets around to. But with Power Platform, technical debt goes way deeper than just the code inside your apps and flows. It lives in your environment settings, your ALM routines, and most dangerously, in those invisible feedback loops that quietly shape how changes ripple or fail to ripple across your systems. And because these feedback loops aren't printed out on any dashboard by default, they tend to accumulate until something big finally breaks. Spotting this kind of technical debt isn't as obvious as finding a broken script or a deprecated connector. Most teams only realize it's there after they've spent hours in a post-mortem digging through logs from a failed release or a platform outage. You know the scenario. Everything looks green on the monitoring dashboard. Deployments push clean from dev to test, but when it lands in production, an unexpected error brings transactions, or worse, entire processes to a halt. Only when the release team sits down to reconstruct the timeline do those hidden loops start to come to light. By then, you're dealing with fallout, not prevention. Take what happened at this global bank. Their Power Platform deployment ran like clockwork, at least on paper. Automated pipelines, multiple environments, standardized configurations, the whole checklist. But they cut one corner. Monitoring the differences between environments got pushed to the back burner. Nobody noticed the slow drift as pipeline permissions and connectors fell slightly out of sync between test and production. For months, their pipeline promoted apps and flows that seemed fine, but on deployment into production, a handful of configurations slipped through the cracks. Broken approvals, data syncs failing in the background, and worst of all, end users lost functionality that was never flagged during testing. It took a massive outage and several days of troubleshooting before anyone traced the issue back to a feedback loop between missing environment variables and untested connector permissions. By then, the business had lost both time and trust. The reality, as Forrester surveys keep reminding us, is that 70% of enterprise Power Platform failures can be traced to feedback loops that were ignored or invisible. That's not just technical debt as an abstract concept. It's hours, days, and sometimes weeks spent untangling why something that worked in dev and test just fell over in prod. Invisible loops are the places where environment rules, ALM process, and governance collide in ways you missed. Let's be honest, nobody has the time to scan every Power Platform environment and map every dependency week after week. So these loops fester in the background until they turn into your next fire drill. The easiest way to picture the cost is to imagine a dashboard that actually shows you every feedback loop running in your organization, environment setup, ALM routines, governance policies, all linked together. Now picture that dashboard, but with some loops glowing red. That's where your support tickets come from. That's where slow release cycles or failed deployments bleed time and money you didn't know you were losing. And the thing is, those red lights are usually simple fixes when spotted early: an environment variable update, a connector whitelist, or a permissions tweak. There's a story that comes up again and again from those who actually take the time to map out their environment and ALM dependencies. One enterprise customer, frustrated by chronic release failures, started sketching out a feedback loop diagram after each incident. They began to spot little leverage points, places where one small change, documented and tested, halved the deployment times and slashed the volume of support tickets for new releases. It wasn't about rewriting code or rebuilding solutions from scratch. Instead, it was the structure of their environments and the clarity of their ALM feedback that made the biggest difference. If you're wondering what your own feedback map would look like, think about it through a practical lens. Where do releases typically fail? Which environments always need a manual fix before moving forward? Ask your team what issues keep coming up even after several permanent fixes. These are all signs of feedback loops that are quietly building cost into your platform. The pattern is usually the same. Shortcuts get taken when nobody's watching. Maybe it's skipping the small step of syncing environment variables. Maybe it's letting permissions differ just for this sprint. Each shortcut is a loop waiting to cause trouble. The most expensive technical debt doesn't live in your code. It's woven into the architecture you build on. Systems thinking is what changes that. By stepping back and actually drawing, or at least mapping, the intersections between your environment's pipeline steps and policy changes, you find where risk hides. And once you see those loops, you can fix them before they become the next Friday afternoon call that ruins a long weekend. So, how much of your platform's risk is running on silent technical debt? If you could see it lighting up a map of your environment, which loop would you tackle first? The habit of looking for these signals before disaster hits is the one discipline that keeps Power Platform management from spiraling. The only question left is whether you spot those loops or let them spot you. Moving into that mindset is what puts you ahead of the next outage instead of scrambling behind it. And it turns every environment and ALM decision into a potential way to save time, money, and even reputation. If you've ever wondered why some teams never seem to get stuck in that endless cycle of fixing the same Power Platform issues, look a little closer at how they design their architectures. Systems thinking isn't jargon, it's a practical way to see how each change feeds back into the whole. Fewer outages and smoother rollouts start with mapping those loops. If you're aiming for releases without late night scrambles or long email chains, pull up your environment ALM diagram and spot the one loop causing the most chaos. Fix that first. These small changes add up faster than most people expect.